Hey everyone, and welcome. We'll give others a few more minutes to join, but while we wait, there was one question that was asked during registration, so I was just going to go over that while we wait. So the question was, how do we pull a summary based on two sets of date ranges? And I wrote this up in a community post, so we can link that in the chat. But I will go over it now just so we can walk through it. So I'll use the credit card activity template as our example, and that's what I used as well in the community post. So what you would do is create a formula column that would return true or false on whether or not the date falls within your date range, and then you could summarize based on that. And so let me just walk through that. So we'll call it range. And to enter a formula, just hit equals, and then that turns it into a formula column. For this one, you have to set the different dates that you want to use within the range. And with that, you need to convert them into datetime objects. And so to make it simple, we will assign each date to a variable. Date one is going to be, then you use date to actually, that's what's going to turn it into a datetime object. And then we just put the date. So 2022 is the year, 6 for the month, 1. And so that's our first date. Then you would just do this for all the dates you want to use within the range. I am going to copy these, make it easier. Okay, so then we have 3 dates, and then the 4th date I'm going to use is actually just today, which is a Python function, and we'll just be able to type that in. And so now you need to compare your dates. So date 1 less than or equal to the value in our date column. Less than or equal to date 2. Or if it falls into the second date range, which is just going to be date 3 less than or equal to that date value, again, in our date column, is less than or equal to today. And again, today is just a Python function that pulls the current date. And so I'll return false if it does not appear in the given date range. But then there are some true ones down here that did fall within that range. And then once you have this, you can create a summary table based on this new column. And so now I can see how many transactions occurred inside that date range, so where it was true, so there were 34 transactions totaling to this amount, or false, they did not occur within the 2 date ranges. And then there were 133, and that was the amount for those. Now you could get a little more complicated with this formula. Let me delete this table so we have more space. We would still leave this because, again, you still just want those dates to compare and you want to be able to convert them into datetime objects. We will leave that. But we will expand on our ranges. So if a date falls into one of these 2 ranges, whether it be between date 1 and date 2, or it's between date 3 and today, then we can assign more to this. So if it falls into that first range, we're just going to copy and paste. So first it's saying, if it falls into either date range, continue to the next line. And so now we're saying if it falls within the first date range, we can return some text. So falls within first range. Now, how these if statements work is they're cascading. So if this is true, meaning that the date falls within one of these 2 ranges, then it moves on to the next. And so if this if statement is then true, it moves on to the next, which is return the statement. Now, if it's not true, we can add another if statement. So now if the date falls within the second range, we can return this text. Now, if this ends up being false, the formula will stop and it just won't return anything. If that's true, but then this one is false, then it'll just go on to the second one. And so the second one would be falls within the second date range. And so again, if it doesn't fall within a range, it's blank. Scroll, scroll, scroll. And then now it'll tell me which range it falls in. And again, we can summarize on this. But now it's going to have all three for me. So whether or not it falls in no range at all, if it falls within the first range, if it falls within the second range. And now I have the number of transactions and then the amount. And again, this is all in a community post, so no worries, you don't need to memorize this, just reference the community post. Okay, so we'll go ahead and jump in. Welcome everyone to our February webinar and happy Mardi Gras. I am in New Orleans, so it is going to be a busy weekend for us. But today is the first webinar in our Working with Your Data series. All of our previous webinars can be found on YouTube, and the recording of this one will be added there as well in the near future. So today we are going to learn all about working with dates. So we'll be working with several templates from our template gallery, and we will post links to each template as we reference them throughout the webinar. And so we will start with our credit card activity template, which we are looking at right now. I'm going to delete the column from before. So starting with the basics, there are two different column types that deal with dates. We have the date column type, which is used for storing calendar dates without a time component. And then we have date time, which is used to store both the calendar date plus that time component. So here on the credit card activity template, this is a date type column. We can check that in the creator panel. To open the creator panel, it says green vertical. And then you're under this column tab. Then we go to column type. So this one is date. You see date time underneath. We'll look at that one next. You can format the date. There's given formats, and you can also create a custom one. When you're creating a custom one, you can just look at these to figure out the coding to create it. So like DO, that's going to be first, second, third, versus DD, which is just the number. And then let's take a look at date time. So we'll share a link to this later. Right now, we're just showing it as the time example. So this one is a date time column. You can tell it's got that time component. With the date time column, you can assign the time zone. You can also set a default time zone for the entire document, which you can do that in the document settings. And just recently, we've added it in the tools menu here. You just click settings, oops, and it'll take you to your document settings, and you can set that time zone. So then if you create multiple date time columns in the document, the new columns will take on that default time zone. With the date time, you can also format the date as well as now the time as well. And both have that custom option. So just like all columns in Grist, you can filter date columns. Date columns do have a special filter. So just click filter data. When I click into start, you see that we have this nice little calendar picker, and it allows you to pick a range of dates to filter by. Suppose you went on vacation and you want to review your purchases made during that time frame. You can pick a start date and an end date, and then the table will filter to show all records within that date range. Let's jump back. We'll look at a summer vacation. And so now I've got this week long, and I can see all my transactions within that date range. And now you can quickly sum too. If you just want to sum the amount in this filtered view, just click and drag, and it'll tell you that sum at the bottom. You can also filter by relative date ranges. So suppose you want to create a dashboard that only shows transactions from the last 7 days, so you can review your spending. Just click last 7 days. It'll show you all transactions within the last 7 days. But you can also select a date in the calendar, and then Grist will suggest other relative ranges. So if I select this Monday of 2 weeks ago, and I can use that as my relative start. And then I can change my relative end to Friday of the week before. And now I have this 2 weeks filtered, but every day it will update to show the Monday from 2 weeks ago to Friday of last week. And whenever you add a new filter to a widget, it will be pinned at the top like you see here. We have date. To unpin it, you just click on it, click the pin so it turns gray, and close. Now it's no longer there, but it is still filtered to the same filtered settings. If you wanted to repin it, you just click that filter icon, click the pin, and it's there again. Often when you have a date column present in a table, you might want to summarize by perhaps month and year, and you can't do that with what you have here. You just have a date. If we tried to summarize by the date, it wouldn't be very helpful. You would just see all transactions on specific dates. We'd rather see it a little more high level. We want to see month and year. And we can do that using formula columns. I'm going to add 2 columns in, and we'll create a month and a year column. Grist has built-in functions for both month and for year, and that's what we're going to use here. So to create a formula column, you just hit the equals key, and then you can start typing your formula. So we call our column that contains the date, which is date, and then we call the function, which is just month, lowercase. And then now it returns that month. And so we can do that again for year. And if you don't want to type the column that contains your date, you can just click it and it inserts it into the formula. And now this time we just do year. And so now we have our month and our year pulled from this date. Easy. And then we can summarize based on that. So here we have month and year. I do want to point out you don't want to just summarize by month, because then all January transactions would summarize together regardless of the year. And that's not really helpful. You'd rather see January 2022 versus January 2023 and February 2022 and so on. So you can select both so that it would group by both. And so here you see that we have 2 lines for February. We have February 2022, February 2023. If we had just grouped by month, it would just show 1 line for February and would show 18 counts. But now we can see our spending habits over every month that we have data for. But you can also do this with just year. So we'll go back, create that summary table again, but this time we can just group by year. And then you can see your spending habits over the course of the year. So again, the formulas here were just date.month and date.year. If you're thinking to yourself, how would I know what these built-in functions are? They're all a secret, and you have to come to all of our webinars to learn all of them. I'm kidding. You can actually find these in the Python standard library. These 2 are specifically Python functions. If you were not aware, the entire Python standard library is available to you to use in formulas, along with some Grist specific formulas and then Excel-like functions as well. So we'll link the function reference guide for you guys. I think I have it open here. This is what it looks like. And it lists out all of the functions that are available. And then they're down below too, so you can see what it does, how to use it, etc. And so we're actually going to cover a couple different functions today that all appear here. So another way to do what we just did is using what's called the strf time format method. So this allows you to create a string representing the date under the control of an explicit format string. So we can format the date string using specific format codes. And these format codes are available within Python's documentation. And we can link that in the chat. I'll show it up here as well. So this is the strf time Python documentation, talks about the method. But the key thing here are these codes. It explains what the code is for, gives an example, and this is what we're covering next. So let me add another column. And this one we're going to call month year, because we're going to combine both into a single one, and strf time allows us to do that. So again, you click the equals key to start entering the formula, say what column contains the date. Again, that's date, and then we call our method. And as I start typing, it does pop up. Next, we need to figure out the codes we want to use. So I just want the month and year. Jump back over. And so we want the month as a 0 padded decimal number. It gives you what it looks like. So we want a lowercase m. And then we want a 4-digit year. And so that's down here with a capital Y. So lowercase m, capital Y. And we enter that into quotes. Because this is a string format method, you use quotes to represent a string. And when you're entering these, you also want to enter any characters to separate month and year. So maybe you just want a space between them. I'm just going to put a dash between the two. Again, lowercase m represented the month, uppercase Y represents the 4-digit year. We have the quote to close it, and then the closing parenthesis. And so now we have month and year in a single column. I can summarize this based on the single column. I don't have to click 2, but it shows the same data. So this is just another way to do the same thing. But the strf time method also allows you to pull the time component from a datetime object. So now let's take a look at that simple time tracker template, and we will link it in the chat. And specifically, we are going to look at the all time calculations page. So we have our column start date and time. It contains the date, it contains the time, date time column. And we just want to pull the time component from this column. And we can do that using strf time. Create a new column, equals key to start the formula. And again, we call the column that contains our datetime object. We can just click it, or if you start typing, it will suggest it. So you don't have to type out your column names if they're lengthy. Grist will start suggesting things. And then call the method. And then we jump back to get our codes. Let's see. First, we want to choose our hour. You can do a 24-hour clock, 12-hour clock. We're going to do 12-hour. That's capital I. And then we need minutes, capital N. Since it's 12-hour, we need to know if it's AM or PM. It's a lowercase p. And then we want the time zone. And that's going to be a capital C. So I looked at these ahead of time. So I can quickly find what I need because I've reviewed it. You'll start using the same ones over and over. So you'll start recognizing roughly where in the chart they are. Jumping back, again, we need those quotes because it's a string. And then you want any separators. So colon to separate hour and minute. One time zone. And that's it. Now we've pulled the time component out from this datetime object. So that is the strf time method. If you're feeling overwhelmed with all of that, I know it's a lot. There's no need to memorize it. Just remember you saw it in this webinar, and then you can reference the recordings on YouTube. At least the first 10 times or so that I did this, I had to go back to a different webinar video to watch Anais do it. But once you kind of get in the habit of it, you learn it. But Anais does tag these when she uploads them to YouTube. So it's easy to jump around and find what you're looking for. Just, you remember that you saw it in this webinar. Here's roughly what we were talking about, and you'll find it. Let's take a closer look at this start date and time column. So when I check this box in the start column, the start date and time column records the current date and the current time for my location. This column's using what we call a trigger formula. We have it up here. Whenever a change is made to the start column, this formula is triggered. And so the formula says if the start column is true or this box is checked, return now. And now is a Python function that returns the current date and time. So that function can be found in that function reference that we had linked before in the chat. There's a second Python function called today, also found in function reference. I'm going to update the end date and time to use today instead of now so we can compare the two. And so end date and time works the same. If I check end, it'll record current date and time. And we see that it does record the current date, but the time is midnight. And that's because the today function only returns the current date value, but doesn't return a time component. Today is specifically useful for date type columns, not date time. If you're using date time, you want to use the function now. And if you're using date, you want to use the function today. One of the useful examples where today's used in a trigger formula is if you just wanted to know the created at date when you create a new record. And then you can make it a trigger formula, do today, and play on changes to new records, meaning when a new record's created, it'll record today's date. And that can be particularly helpful if you just need to track when records are created in your system, or if you need to track when a change was made. That's when these trigger formulas can be especially helpful. But again, just to reiterate, today is date, and then now is date time. Today, we're going to cover another useful function with today. For example, if you want to assign a due date for a task that's 7 days after today, you could do that using the today function. And so we're going to use the team meetings organizer, which we'll link in the chat. In this meeting minutes table, you have a type, who's contributing. Basically, it's the meeting minutes as you're going through your meeting. We have a topic, and then we have a deadline. So when there were these actions, there would be a deadline assigned. We can have this deadline auto-assigned for us to be 7 days after the task was created. And we can do this using what's called the DATEADD function. And we'll link this specific function in the chat. Again, it's in that function reference document. So I'm going to open the creator panel here. And we're going to set a trigger formula for this deadline column with the DATEADD function. So as you start typing again, it's going to give you suggestions. Here we have DATEADD, and it's telling you exactly what you need to include. So we need to have a start date, which in our case, it's going to be today, and then the number of days, months, years, weeks, etc. that you want to add on to this date to return. So we want to do today plus 7. So DATEADD, and then we'll use the today function to call today's date, and then days equals 7. And we'll apply it to new records. When a new record is created, then this deadline is assigned. But because it's a trigger formula, I can still update this date as needed. So maybe this particular item is due tomorrow. I could update that. But at least it would auto assign it for you. So you don't have to assign a date every single time you create something. It will at least give that most common suggestion for you. Now for this particular one, assigning a due date for an accomplishment doesn't really make sense. The only thing we need a due date for are these actions. And so we can modify our formula to make a little more sense for this particular usage. So if the type, this column is type, equal to action, and that's the string, we would want this DATEADD function to be returned. And so now if I add accomplishment, it's blank, but if I go ahead and add an action, now it has that date 7 days in the future assigned for a deadline. So that's a handy use of the today function. When you have the option to use a Grist function like DATEADD or a Python function like time delta, which is preferable, it is up to you, really. Typically, we will demonstrate the Grist or Excel-like functions because that's what people are most familiar with, and they're typically a lot cleaner, but you can use the Python functions. I know when I was doing the date, specifically in the initial question at the beginning, I used this date function versus using Python's datetime. So you can use either, whichever you're more comfortable with. Okay, so now we are moving into our grand finale. We are going to learn how to find the earliest or latest date in a list. Typically, people want to find the earliest date in a list, so that's the example we will use today. This is rather complicated, but again, you can always reference these recordings to come back to it. But we are going to use our lightweight CRM as our example document. And we're going to link that in the chat. You see we have this list of contacts and it has a due date and then a to-do item. The formula in this due column is looking up all records in the interactions table with the type to do for this particular contact. Then of those records, it finds the item with the soonest date, the minimum date. We are going to walk through this step by step. So I'm just going to add a new column for our new walkthrough. Now we are going to use a Grist function for this. It's called lookup records. It allows you to look up records in another table based on some match. We want to look up records in this interactions table that are assigned to this company, where the company and the contact match. Now we see that this contact column is a reference column that points back to the contacts table. So this points to this. Right now it is showing the company name, so it looks like a match. We can see that Scorer and Nia now is the same contact here. But I want to point out that reference columns do store the row ID. So this is actually what is stored in a reference column. Is this contacts 20? That is the ID for this one here. If I add a column, I can pull the ID to show you. So this is the record ID. That's auto-assigned in Grist. It's a unique ID for each record. So if I click on this one, it's 7. This is 7. And so that little bit hopefully will make this next portion a little bit easier to understand. Okay, so we're going to work on this lookup records function. We need to tell it where we want to look this data up. We want to find records from the interactions table. So we start typing interactions and it will start suggesting things. We want to know all the records that match. So we want to use lookup records. Now underneath that, it does have this other suggestion, contact equals ID. That's because this contact column stores the record ID. And so that's actually what we want, is we want to match where the contact and company match. And so for this case, because it's a reference column, contact equals ID. It is going to return a list of records. So it's finding all records in this interactions table where those two match. So for this particular company, it's showing 7 and we have 7. So we can confirm here, this is showing 2 records. We have 2 records here. I'll change this. I'll hide that so we don't need to see that now. Here are 3. So we know that it's working so far. We have our list of records. Specifically, we want records where this type is to do. We don't need to see all interactions. We just want to see interactions with this type to do. And we can add that here. So the column is type, and we want type to equal to do, and that's a string. We put it in quotes. There we go. So now we're looking up records in the interactions table where the company matches, and now the type is to do. And so our list gets shorter. So here it says that there's 2. It shows 2 over here, 2 here. And you can just double check that way. So now we have this list of records. Again, company matches, type is to do. And we can keep building from here. Of this list of records, we can use dot notation to pull more data. That just means put a dot and then put the column names, which do notes. And now we're pulling the notes for those 2 records, or dates. And so now I have the dates for the 2 records where the type is to do. We are going to take this off. We are going to assign our list of records to a variable. It just helps keep your formula looking clean. So as you're learning, it just helps separate the steps. So we're going to call this to do tasks. And then we'll assign that to the variable. So if I return to do tasks, we will see that it returns the same list as we saw before. And I can use the same dot notation on this to pull in the date. It's just like algebra when you replace X and Y with some number. Here we're just replacing anywhere you see to do tasks, it's getting replaced with this. Now of these dates, we want to know the soonest date. We want to know what to do task is due the soonest so we can get to it. So we use the min function. And again, the min function is found in our function reference. And so now it's going to return the soonest date in that list. So we can confirm, is 3:10 sooner than 9:1? Yeah, it is. 5:13, yep, and this one's later. So it is showing the minimum. But now we have this error. And if you click in, it will describe what the error is for. In this case, it is erroring out when there's no to-do tasks. So if there's no task assigned to this company that is typed to do, we don't have this list that we're trying to create. And you can't take a minimum of a non-existent list. So it's returning this error. So we can add on to our function to get rid of the error. So if there's to-do tasks, we want to return the minimum. If there's no to-do tasks, we don't want to return anything. So saying return this if to-do tasks, meaning if there's anything in the to-do tasks list. If not, return nothing. And that gets rid of our error. Now, the opposite, if you wanted to return the max date in a list, just change min to max, and that'll give you that max date in the list. So that is how to do that extreme lookup records function that you see in our lightweight CRM. again, don't feel overwhelmed by this. Feel free to jump back to the webinar to review that. But does anyone have any questions? Why is Python so cool? Python is the best. I don't know why it is the best. Some things you just accept.
Also, I think Jordan might have missed the summary by date ranges. If you want to just point again to the post here that explains it, because I think it was Jordan's question, and I think you might have missed this.
Jordan, I'm linking this again in the chat, the community post. I wrote this up to explain the answer to your question, which was, let me pull that back up. I think it was how to summarize on 2 date ranges. Here, I write up this sample showing a simple one where it returns true or false on whether or not that date occurs in that one of 2 date ranges. And then the second one actually returns a string. So let me show you here. So first off, you use the date function to turn each of the dates in your ranges into datetime objects. So I just assigned them to variables to keep it clean, but then you use this date function to convert the date. So year, month, and then day. And then I'm going to copy paste the other 2 dates I used. And then next you actually use them in the range. So date less than or equal to be that as well. So if the date falls in between date 1 or date 2, or if the date in the date column falls between date 3 or today, it'll return true or false. And then you can summarize based on that. And so if it did fall in either of those date ranges, it returned true. And then I could see the summary of the data. Or if it didn't fall in the date ranges, I have this other one. Now, I expanded on this a bit, where you can return different things based on which date range it fell into. Do that as well. So if it fell into either of these date ranges, it would move on to the next step. So if it falls within the first range, then it returns the string falls within the first range. If it falls into the second range, then it returns that string. Oops. What did I do?
Is it indentation? Is the if too far over?
Maybe.
And then the returns. The returns as well need to come back 1 tab.
Yeah, I'll just recopy and paste.
Yeah, I think it's just indentation.
Okay. And so then with those extra steps in there, it then breaks it out into falls within the first range. Here's the summary. Falls within the second range. Here's the summary. And then if it didn't fall into either date range, it gave a summary of that as well. But again, all of that is in that post. So feel free to post there if you have any questions or maybe a follow-up question to it. I feel like we've gotten a lot of questions about date ranges and summary tables lately, so hopefully it helps a lot of people. Awesome. Any other questions?
think that might be it. Thank you so much. I love the grand finale.
Well, thank you guys. Appreciate y'all joining with us today. Have a good one.